Hi, friends. I was called for jury duty this week and selected to sit on the grand jury, which runs from now until the end of the year every Wednesday. So if you hear that I was in jail this week, it's not because I got in trouble, but it's the grand jury's responsibility to inspect the jail and make sure that the inmates are being treated properly. It was really interesting to see and to hear about how things worked. And as nice as our Licking County Jail is, it's nowhere I want to live. After leaving jury duty today, I needed to decompress, and so I went over to Black Hand Gorge and ran, and after 8.5 miles in this beautiful weather, I felt much better. It also put me a little behind recording this video, and you may hear the choir singing in the background. They're rehearsing upstairs. Last Sunday, we thought about the Old Testament prophets and their relationship with God's kingdom. The prophets spoke at different times to different people in different situations. They conveyed God's messages of judgment and punishment, as well as God's messages of promise and restoration. Whatever the context and the content of the prophet's message, it was always rooted in God's covenant and reaching toward God's kingdom. We didn't have time on Sunday to talk about some of the images that the prophets used to describe God's kingdom. Of course, they use words like justice and righteousness and peace and equity and mercy and generosity, but they also use pictures, word pictures, of course. For example, the prophet Zechariah, one that we focused on Sunday, paints a picture of a city park where older adults are sitting on benches, implying that there's peace and plenty so that people live a long time. And children are playing in the park, which is always a sign of hopefulness. In Zechariah 8, 4 and 5, speaking of the New Jerusalem, or God's kingdom, the Lord of heavenly force proclaims, "Old men and old women will again dwell in the plazas of Jerusalem. Each of them will have a staff in their hand because of their great age. The city will be full of boys and girls playing in its plazas." The prophet Micah in chapter 4 paints a picture of the nations streaming to the mountain of God to learn God's ways. God arbitrates among them and supervises them as they melt down weapons of war to make farming implements. Verses 2 and 3 read, "Many nations will go and say, 'Come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob's God, so that he may teach us his ways, and we may walk in God's paths.' Instruction will come from Zion, and the Lord's word from Jerusalem. God will judge between the nations and settle disputes of mighty nations which are far away. They will beat their swords into iron plows, and their spears into pruning tools. Nation will not take up sword against nation. They will no longer learn how to make war." Those are just a couple examples from the images that the prophets used to describe God's kingdom. Next week, I'll share one more from the prophet Isaiah when he describes God's kingdom as a great feast. All of these images are intended to call us back to God, who is faithful and forgiving, and to call us forward into God's kingdom, where all people live in righteousness and all nations live in peace. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next week.